Power.
Now it works. There's a hidden little button down there. All right, so for the recording, Mark Funkhauser, Funkhauser and Associates, we're working on the 2045 Comprehensive Plan. We have had a series of experts come in. We had one on housing, we had one on economic development, we will have one on public safety, and we will have one on sustainability. Tonight, we have Kristie Chin. Dr. Chin is a director of the Civic Innovation at the University of Texas at Austin's Center for Transportation Research. She leads an interdisciplinary team who manage a portfolio of smart mobility projects for the Texas Department of Transportation and other Texas transportation agencies. She co-founded the Texas Innovation Alliance, a statewide network of smart cities, and has degrees in civil engineering and architecture, including a PhD in transportation engineering. She's a Notre Dame graduate and previously worked for the city of South Bend as a performance improvement analyst. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Chin with us tonight. Kristie?
Thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm very excited to be talking about transportation. I think South Bend very much has deep roots in the transportation space. Starting with the Studebaker plant, transportation drove everything from South Bend's economy to its very urban fabric. And so when we think about transportation, it's impossible to extricate these two things from one another. We're going to be talking a lot about what's coming up for South Bend as part of the 2045 Comprehensive Plan. And what's interesting is that South Bend was originally built at a time when there were really two parts of the American dream, right? We had the white picket fence. We also had car ownership. And so when we think about these two things, we've come a very long way. Fast forward to now, and as part of this 2045 planning exercise, South Bend really has an opportunity in front of it to rethink what is not only just the American dream, but how do we localize it and think about what we want for our community here today. And so for this discussion tonight, I'm going to break it down into three different parts. We're going to start with housing and transportation, then we're going to move into transit, and then we're going to wrap up with some of the interesting things that are happening in the technology space. So I'd like to start off with a question. So I'm hoping to make this an interactive discussion. So I'd like to hear what folks think is the #1 determinant in good health.
Connections.
That's a good piece. What else? Environment. Income. So we have a very bright crowd. I was hoping somebody might go for it in terms of it's not the DNA and it's not your genetic code, but it turns out it's actually your zip code. And so when we think about it, we have to think about really the impacts of all the different things that were raised. What is the impacts of our built environment? And really to illustrate this point, I wanted to tell the tale of two different zip codes. And so I picked out a couple in the Chicago area. So we're going to start off with 60621 on the left-hand side, which is Inglewood. And then we're going to compare that to 60611, which is Streeterville. And so if we take a look at these different factors, when it comes to health, a study was done to look at the life expectancy. And the life expectancy between these two different zip codes was 30 years apart. And that is just drastic. And so when we think about, well, why might that be? And so there's a number of factors in the built environment. That might be from emissions, that might be from opportunities to have active transportation, whether you're walking or biking. And it also might even come from access to healthy foods. I recently learned a new term. You may have heard of a food desert. The new term that was introduced to me was a food swamp. And so food desert, maybe you don't have any options, but the food swamp, what are your options? You have the 7-Eleven, you have fast food, you have the local gas station. So how do we think about all the different health factors that go into creating positive places? It also has an impact too on the education system. So the disparities in a zip code and really in the school system, there's a number of factors that can impact a student's ability for high school graduation, which then goes on to compound in terms of the economic mobility. So if we just look at the median household income between these two different zip codes, they're worlds apart. And so when we look at what's happening in Inglewood, the median income there is below $25,000. That has one of the highest poverty rates in the entire country compared to well over six figures there in Streeterville. And so I think it's important to think about really how does a place and all the different components in a neighborhood go on to impact these different dimensions. Breaking it down now to look at what happens in the transportation space. So we have the two different transportation profiles of these neighborhoods. So on top we have Inglewood, and on the bottom we have Streeterville. So even though both of these neighborhoods, there's quite a bit of driving and car dependence, if we look at the third piece in terms of what's happening in the public transit space, we can see that 34% of the population is relying on public transit. And that's because there's a heavily transit-dependent population. They maybe don't have the same income and the same means for car ownership. And therefore, these riders need to be able to access the different opportunities, whether it's going to school, going to work, or even to the grocery store. And then I also want to draw folks' attention to what's happening with Streeterville. And the walking percentage is around 30%. And that's because of the sidewalk infrastructure, the bikeability. And so there's a number of ways in which the street and the infrastructure design go on to impact what people are able to do. And then lastly, the work from home column. I think that goes to show the difference in economic opportunities and career paths that are available. So in Inglewood, many folks have to rely on that public transit system in order to be there for essential worker types of positions. And so all these different ingredients in a neighborhood, they really go on to impact your health, your education, your income opportunities, and really how can you take transportation to different places. And so why does this happen? And it really starts off with single-use zoning. And so there's been a separation of uses. I have a background in both architecture as well as engineering. And even in our education system, these two things that are very integral to one another have been separated. And so that's also manifested in the built environment. So we have places where people are living, which is separate than when you might go get the grocery store, the retail opportunities, think about all the strip malls, which is different than where you have to go to work. And most of the time, a lot of places you have to drive to all these different locations in order to put them together. And let's say you do want to put a public transit system in this type of a built environment. It's actually very challenging and requires a lot of resources because you need high enough density and high enough people in order to have that demand in order to be able to fuel that public transit network. So now let's compare that to a much more compact type of design. So now think about your home and where can you go to a coffee shop, where can you pick up a sandwich, where can you work, where can you get to the hospital. Thinking about all these different pieces within even just a 5 or 10 minute walk. So how do we fit these two things together? So they come together in a concept that many of you may have heard called transit-oriented development. So go ahead and just shout out a few things. What are some of the things that you see in this photo?
Bookshop.
Yep. What else?
Bike lane.
Bike lane?
Healthcare.
Healthcare?
Restaurant.
Yes. So you can see all these different pieces, they really work together. And so we heard a number of different things. So let's just take the housing piece. So we have the affordable housing, and we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of having a variety of housing types. We talk about density so that we have enough people living in these locations to be able to support and fuel that public transit network. And then in terms of the mixed use, we had bookshop, we had supermarket, hospital, all these different things are now within access to people, whether it's through biking, walking, the transit system. So thinking about how do we provide people and communities with choice in their transportation system. And then lastly, thinking about the equity components. So it's important to think about the accessibility of the infrastructure, inclusivity. How do we design for all age ranges, all the way from school children to seniors to those who are going to have to give up driving? What are the opportunities that we're going to be able to provide people once that is no longer an option? And then lastly, the affordability piece. I currently live in Austin, Texas, and Austin, as well as many cities, are really going through an affordability crisis right now. And so I think it's important where South Bend is at a wonderful juncture to be able to think about how do we preserve that affordability in the community and make sure that that's part of these plans as we move forward. And so I've gone ahead and put together a few different toolkits for each of these. And so I wanted to share those with folks today. So starting off with healthy housing. I was here in 2014, and that's when South Bend was going through the exercise of identifying all of its vacant and abandoned properties. And so when the Studebaker plant closed, there was a tremendous exodus in terms of people, and as a result, what happened to the housing when those jobs were lost. And so we're at a good opportunity to think about what do we do with those vacant and abandoned properties? How do we think about the different lot design? And the housing department here in South Bend has gone ahead and tried to make it as easy as possible. So there's a number of these lots, but what do we do with them? And for those who want to put housing on there, they've developed a pre-approved list. So all these different plans, I believe that there are more that are coming available, but it's looking at a variety of types. So this is going to range from a single family home, cottage style, all the way up to multifamily duplexes. And what's nice about this is that developing some of these plans can really be a barrier to people, but having them pre-approved and as part of the design process, the city is able to work with communities in this process. And this goes into the missing middle housing. I think that that's something that South Bend is really looking for in terms of how do we take these different properties and provide a range of housing options that fit the low income all the way up to the affluent. How do we focus on some of that missing middle housing in order to provide people an opportunity for any housing type that they might want to consider? And so as part of this process, there's a number of these pre-approved plans, and South Bend's already making headways on those. And so I think it's great to see the progress that's been made. I think there's going to be continued progress. And how do we now think, not just about the housing component, but what goes around the housing? So one of the concepts that I wanted to raise is what's called the H&T budget, or the housing and transportation budget. So you may be familiar with the rule of thumb that you're only supposed to spend about 30% of your budget on housing. Well, it turns out that where you choose to live, you're inherently making a choice about what transportation options are available to you. So let's take the example on the left. Maybe you want to live a little bit further out because housing is more affordable. But as a result, the family maybe has to own 2 cars, and they therefore have to drive almost all the places. And what comes with driving, not only the maintenance of the vehicle, but the parking, the gas, everything that comes with car ownership. Now compare that to the right-hand side. So maybe the family spends a little bit more on housing to live closer to kind of the downtown area. But that also opens up a number of walking, public transit, and other opportunities for transportation. So we have historically decoupled these things, but as we move forward, I think this is going to be an important piece for South Bend to be able to not only think about its housing and transportation plans together, but also to go through that public education process to work with the communities to help think about when they go to do their own personal budgeting, how do these two things work together? And this ties in to the next concept, which is the 15-minute city. So if we go back to that compact urban development, think about what you can currently do from your house. Can you get to work? Can you get to all these different amenities? And this idea that you're able to access them all within 15 minutes. That impacts, if you remember from the beginning, that's going to have health benefits. It's going to impact the educational opportunities, the income. And so by co-locating all these different services, that enables people to cut down on their transportation costs and also provide supported housing. And then in terms of some of the key components to activating neighborhood design, it's not just important to have the housing and the other services, but even just activating the spaces from public events to small businesses, thinking about how all these different components work together. And I think this is an exciting opportunity just to see what South Bend is able to do downtown. Whenever there was the shift from one-way streets to two-way, it brought a lot of energy back into the city, and to be able to have First Fridays and other types of events. It wakes people up to kind of what the city can be, and it's not just about the transportation piece, but it's really about the destination. What are you going to see? Who are you going to see? And those activities that take place there. And then the last piece I wanted to raise is the complete street design. Had an opportunity to meet with the city team earlier who's working on this, and it's exciting just to see how do we think about not only the streets as a place for cars, which was the historical mentality, but really thinking about how to bring all these different components together. And so this is an example from Austin, but it lays out how do we think about street design, not just as a thoroughfare for cars, but as a place for people. And so this includes the sidewalk infrastructure, a protected bike lane, this island here that then helps cut down on the space as people then have to travel over a few lanes in order, that's the university there in the background. And so South Bend's got a number of complete street efforts that are already underway, and I think that that's a great foundation to build upon. And so I just wanted to raise, there's been 4 recent neighborhood development plans, so I just wanted to see, hear from each of you in terms of what are some of the things that you would like to see in your neighborhood or as part of the South Bend 2045 planning process. Yes.
I can't excuse me. I can't currently get any food from where I live without getting in a car. It's just not feasible. And I'd love to be able to, whether it's a restaurant or a grocery store, but to be able to access food without having to get in a car would be great.
That's great. What about others? Is there something that you wish that you could see in your neighborhood today?
I think echoing on to what the previous person said is it's not just food, but it's that variety of food options, as well as, like, we talk about other third places, like even bars or coffee shops or other things like that, that can create that 15-minute walkable destination. But probably on top of that is just what I want to see is the economics to make that work in neighborhoods, maybe, because if that was there, I think, and if we could help make that happen, we can make the zoning right, we can make those policy shifts to enable it. But it's then so what? It's enabled, but who's going to do it and how are we going to get it done? I think that's the part I want to see in terms of the execution of those elements.
That's great. I think thinking about how do you start with particular nodes, and like you're saying, it's not enough just to have one business or one grocery store. This idea that by bringing them together, you can create enough of a nexus. It becomes a good candidate for a public transit stop. The idea that there's enough housing around it to be able to support that. And so I think incrementalism, I think, is what I would like for folks to take away from this. The South Bend planning process, it's not something that happens overnight. And I think that the community engagement part that has been long underway, it's a great symbol. And so each of these plans, in addition to those that are coming, I would just encourage folks to get involved. All of those ideas contribute to these plans, but then they ultimately bubble up and form a more cohesive vision. And so your participation ensures that these solutions are localized, the things that you want to see, are able to be part of that neighborhood, and then ultimately form the city that you would like to be a part of. And so now I want to move into go ahead, please.
Just two thoughts. One, I live in the Northeast neighborhood, so we do have Eddy Street Commons, but being a longtime resident, it'd be great to have something that's more mom and pop kind of place, like restaurants and coffee shops that is not just part of a chain or something big, that is, they get to know the people there. I mean, there are some things like Sunny Italy's and other places that are walkable, which are great, but it'd be nice to have something that's more locally based that builds our economy. And the second thing is, I have school-age children, and when I grew up here, we could walk to our school, but now a lot of kids are bused because of the various schools that they go to, and part of the reason, like, my kids go to private schools probably because of I didn't want to bus my kids across town to a different school. I wanted them to be able to walk or ride their bike to school. So I've heard like a lot of older people who've also had to walk to school because all the eyes were on the kids. A lot of people, they knew the neighbors, they knew the kids who go to the school. So I think, even though I know, but I think having public schools that are within neighborhoods to bring that back, but still strengthen them so that they're all have a good education.
Yeah,
would be good for neighborhoods.
I think that's great. There's a program, it's called the Safe Routes to School, and I think that it's exactly what you're talking about. Not only is it about the school, but it's about how do people get there, making sure that it's safe for the kids to go, and then just providing people with the options. So not only do you want them to be able to walk, but then having that infrastructure around it and the community to be able to support it. And then that's a good segue too into the next section in terms of public transit. So how many folks here ride the bus? All right, we have one. And then for those who didn't raise their hand, which is almost everybody else, then what would it take for you to ride the bus?
It only runs like roughly once an hour, maybe it's a half hour a few times. And so to have to wait that long outside just isn't feasible.
Run it, and then if you miss the one bus, and then what? Do you have to wait another hour? So you brought up the shelter, the weather, the time between buses. What else?
I think is the stigma attached to it?
Yes.
And sort of destigmatizing.
No, I think that's great. We were talking earlier just about the chicken and the egg in terms of why people don't want to fund provide and invest in the public transit system because no one rides the bus. And it's this spiral where there's this misconception. But by investing in the bus and improving that system, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity that can happen because people will choose to take something when there's a high enough demand, if it's going to the appropriate destinations, and like you're saying, if there's that reliability. Go ahead, sir.
You actually said it at the end there. It's the destination.
Yeah.
So it's the frequency, but it's also where it goes or its destination.
Yep. And so, yes.
I would ride the bus if there was some sort of a system to track where the buses are. So if we could, know when the buses come, if there was a way I could get that schedule on my phone, I think that would really give me a sense of when I can catch this bus or the next bus and so forth.
Yep.
So technology.
Yep. Having that information in real time, I think is important.
I would also add in with that, think about the transition if I have to go to downtown where they have the center where you transit, when you change.
The transfers.
Transfer.
Yep.
Having the sense of safety, when I've gone there, granted it might be something implied that I don't feel safe, but just simply, I
good lighting and having a safe environment around you.
Yeah, I mean, I know when it was more central downtown, I felt a little more safe because there's a little bit more eyes on me, but where it's at is someone in an island as to where it's at, and there's not a lot around there. So if I'm walking, even when I get out, there's no place to walk to.
Yep.
So like restaurants or anything around that immediate area.
No, I
That
think
makes sense.
It does. And so all these different components, and then I put this slide up there because a lot of people would ride transit, obviously if they had ultimate power, but the concept that I really wanted to talk about was mobility on demand. And so if we think back particularly to the early Netflix days, right, we could sit on our couch and within one streaming platform, there were movies, there were TV shows, there were documentaries, there was stand-up comedy, and all of these different services were being aggregated into one app. And so what's happening with a lot of transit agencies right now is they're in search for that one app to rule them all. And so when I talk about public transit, I'm going to emphasize two different things, convenience and choice. And so I think it's really important to think about what's happening and how do we provide enough transportation options that are going to be accessible for everybody. And so something I want to highlight is a process that's going on right now. It's the Connect Transit effort. And so a lot of the things that were raised earlier, whether it was the frequency, the reliability, the safety issues, and then Jatin, what you had talked about in terms of where's the bus, that's something called automated vehicle location. So there's going to be technology to be able to provide that information and push it out to the public so we know when the bus is coming, how reliable is it, and then what's happening is there's a planning process currently underway to redesign the routes. And so something that is happening, the transit network was traditionally built around this hub and spoke model, this idea that people live outside, they need to come downtown, and then they go back home. But South Bend has evolved, and there's a lot of new destinations, new places, new housing. And so how do we think about a transit network that's going to match the way that people are living and working today? One of the pieces is the trunk system. So trying to develop the backbone of the transit network. And so identifying and prioritizing key routes and then investing heavily in those routes. In particular, coming up with what's called bus rapid transit. And so that's taking those 60-minute headways, that time from between when one bus comes now and when the next one comes, that's called headway. And so taking those 60-minute headways, now what happens if a bus came every 15 minutes? So it's more reliable. If I miss this one, I'll catch the next one. I'm not having to wait outside in the cold for that long. And I have that guarantee and the reliability. And so thinking about how we can invest in bus rapid transit, where maybe prioritizing certain routes and then investing in that trunk system, thinking about how do we develop that backbone for the public transit network. And then beyond that, kind of how do you get people into that trunk system? So the trunk system, if you think about it like the arteries, well, what happens in the capillaries around it? And so something that transit agencies are looking at now are what called pickup zones. And so this would be like a shuttle, for example, and think about a particular district. There are transit agencies that are saying, okay, we will pick you up and drop you off anywhere within this zone. So we'll pick you up at your house and we'll drop you off at the grocery store, or a lot of them are also picking folks up at their home and then taking them to the nearest public transit stop. So you're working on the outskirts, so maybe they're a little bit farther away from that trunk network, but being able to get them into the system where now you have high routes that are going to go every 15 minutes directly to downtown or directly to some of these other key destinations. The other part I wanted to raise were just private sector solutions. This is a company called VIA. I believe MACOG is currently working with them, but this is an image of a project that is in Arlington, Texas. In Arlington, Texas, it was previously the largest city without a traditional public transit network. So it had no public transit system. And the city, they said, okay, we're not going to invest in the typical bus and rail but we want to leapfrog and use technology. We want to partner with industry. And so they partner with this company to be able to do on-demand rideshare service. And so this would be where you're able to call up using your phone and then ride with 3 or 4 other people to an appropriate destination. And so there's opportunities both in the public sector as well as with some of these public-private opportunities. And then the last part I wanted to talk about in this section is a concept called mobility as a service. And so if you look on the left-hand side, this is how it's currently done, right? If you want to ride the bus, it's one payment system. If you want to take a taxi, if you're carpooling, if you're biking, there's all these different transportation solutions. They all require a different type of payment, but none of them communicate with one another. The idea of mobility as a service, if you think back to that Netflix analogy, the idea with mobility as a service is that all of these things are now integrated in one single platform. So now you can plan your trip from point A to point B, and maybe you're walking to the bus stop, maybe you take the bus. At the bus stop, there's a bike that you could then take to wherever you're going. It's this idea that now you have a seamless mobility network in the palm of your hand. You're able to compare different payment options, and then when you find the right one for you, you're able to pay for it all within the same platform. And so, what are the different transportation options that are out there? The transportation space is just exploding with a number of new technologies and services. So just to highlight a few, on the left-hand side, we have our traditional public transit and taxi, but there's also car share, bike share, the ride-hailing, such as the Uber and Lyft, that a lot of folks maybe take from the airport. Microtransit, which is similar to that Via solution, where you're able to hail a ride and get dropped off within a zone, or even get dropped off at the local bus stop. Scooters and the bike share, as well as carpooling, are all different options. And so transportation doesn't have to mean just one thing. It's thinking about how do we provide people with choice. And so now how do we think about what does that mean in terms of the design footprint? And so the physical manifestation of these can be what is known as a mobility hub. So this idea that not only are you going to have your bus stop, but you can co-locate a number of these other services. And so by identifying these key nodes, whether that might be the library or City Hall or some of the key restaurant districts, trying to identify these key places where a mobility hub might be appropriate so that people are able to access all these different transportation options in one place. And then the other good news is that South Bend has already done a portion of this. There's a good framework here. It's known as the Commuters Trust, and it's a program that the city did as part of a Bloomberg Philanthropies grant, where people who are trying to get to work, for a lot of folks, transportation and the cost of transportation can be a major barrier. And so as part of this grant program, they created essentially what is a mobility wallet, this idea that through the program you could either take an Uber, a Lyft, or the bus. And so for folks who are trying to get to work, these 3 different options were now within a single mobility wallet. And that is a great seed for what could eventually come to ultimately achieve that mobility as a service picture that was painted before. So now I just wanted to open up. We've got an opportunity in front of us with the planning process that's currently underway, but I wanted to hear what some of the things are that you would like to see as part of South Bend's transit system for 2045.
Well, we talked a lot about a train to downtown South Bend, and even though it's difficult, I still think it should be part of the vision of South Bend, even if it's not achieved in 2045. But keep that in mind and continue to plan for that potential future.
Yeah, I think it's important to be able to create that vision for the city, and even if it doesn't happen immediately, starting that planning process now, working and engaging the stakeholders, and really trying to think about what are the economic opportunities as well as the funding that might be able to realize a vision like that. Any other types of items that y'all would like to see as part of the transit plan?
I'd like to see sort of an expanded bike share. I think right now we have a limited number of bikes as part of our relationship with our current bike share provider. But I think we're lacking in other than just a larger number of them. I think a diversity in the bikes. Bikes that are available to carry cargo, that can are adaptable for different types of riders of abilities and sizes and ages, and also make sure that I think there's a better leverage given to bike share as a transportation option in general.
That's great. I've seen it where cities do both a docked bike share program at key places. There's the dockless, where there's a little bit more flexibility, but you're able to kind of geofence them in particular areas of the city. And then I've also seen for e-bikes, where they do have some motor. So if you're either going uphill or going in the grocery store, you get a little bit more power behind you.
I would say connectivity between neighborhoods in the downtown. I know there's been some, like with the Coal Line Trail, beginning from the Lincoln Way going towards campus. But I even know, like on the Portage Avenue corridor and even the Rum Village and other areas, to have more connectivity that we can have within shared path, shared use spaces, or in walkability. But and also I think of public transportation. I think of like my own kids going to colleges and areas that have that they feel more accessible, I guess, with the public transportation. And that I think that if we had, I guess, I don't know, if somehow we can increase ridership and increase with possibly the new plan we can have to get more people on it, to get more used to it, so that we have less driving. Does that make sense?
It does. I think you had talked about just the continuity of network, right? Like, let's take the sidewalk, for example. If you're walking along the sidewalk and all of a sudden it stops, you have to move into the street. Now that's less safe. That's a break in continuity. Same thing for the bike network. If you're biking along and it's a combination, one of my colleagues was actually in a biking accident in Texas, where the bike path moved from sidewalk to street, and the car didn't see them. And so trying to create continuity in the network, looking at these different bike lane protections, and just making sure that the infrastructure is able to support a variety of uses.
For some individuals that take public transportation, it's I don't necessarily need it, but for some people that take public transportation, the issue is they have packages. Being able to have maybe a space or a place to store those packages, and how do you make it so that it's doable, so that if it's maybe, say, 2 bags, or, I mean, they couldn't carry a carload of stuff, certainly, but many of them need to have a space for a couple bags of groceries, maybe 2 bags, maybe 2 baskets of laundry. So a space that they could do that. And how do you do that so that you're not in the way, or that it's equal for everybody?
Exactly. I think the universal design piece, thinking about not only the people, but either if they're going to the grocery store, if they're going to a friend's house, or even if they're traveling with their family. I think making sure that it's designed for a number of purposes, both for people as well as any goods that might be coming along. And then the last part that I wanted to talk about was technology. And so I wanted to start with this image. I encountered this at a CVS. And so anytime we talk about technology, the question that I would hope everybody asks is really, what problem are we solving? And whenever I went to the CVS, for whatever reason, they had put these digital advertising screens in front of the glass windows. And so It's impossible to see anything that's inside. I have to open the door and stand there in order to find out the information. And it didn't make any sense. And so it might be cool and it might be flashy, but what problem does it really solve? And so there's a lot of technologies that are happening in the transportation space. And so this was a positive example that I wanted to share. I think a number of places, particularly during the pandemic, did this. So when everybody was having to work from home or kids were having to go to school, a lot of places they would take the school buses or the public transit buses and they turned them into mobile hotspots. That way, for any kids or families who didn't have Wi-Fi at home, they were able to still go and be able to engage and do their schoolwork. And so there might be a lot of cool technologies that are out there. We're going to talk about some of them, but as you think about it, always make sure that it's not technology for technology's sake. It's really going to be purpose-driven. And so some of the major technologies, there's a major wave that's happening in the automation space. And so it maybe started off with the Google car, and then there was the wave where there are a lot of major headlines, this idea that we're going to have robo-taxis everywhere. At least when it comes to industry, there's really been a wake-up call that it's progressing slower than expected, but it's still a wave that's coming. And so thinking about how do we prepare the infrastructure, as well as how do we prepare people for these driverless vehicles. And so just to share some examples of the type of vehicles that are coming. On the top left, we have automated shuttles. A lot of places that are starting, there's a few different use cases. One of them around college campuses. So this might be something for game day shuttle, for example. Arlington did this in their entertainment district where they have a number of restaurants and bars as well as the Rangers Stadium. And so thinking about how a shuttle on a fixed route might be able to transport people back and forth. The top right is an on-demand shuttle service. So this is an application that's well suited for kind of retail types of districts. Eddie Commons, for example, this idea where there are certain designated stops that people could go. The driverless vehicle would come, you could get in, and it would take you either to the next restaurant or back to work or back to your house. And so think about these retail types of spaces where there's still close proximity, but the vehicle is able to map out and have a pretty known network. The bottom left, we have long-haul trucking. And so there's, this is probably the use case that is furthest along in terms of where automation stands today. In Texas, there are 5 different companies alone already operating on the interstate system today. And so you might hear automation and think that that's happening 20 years, 10 years, and I'm here to let you know that it's happening on roadways today. And so because it's a simpler use case in the sense of, if you think about a highway, you're primarily going straight. You don't have people cutting across. You don't have people walking their dogs or things jumping out at you. It's a pretty typical, simple use case. And so the long-haul trucking is one of the areas that we're going to see automation take place more quickly than others. Then the bottom right is a sidewalk delivery robot. And so one of the examples that I've seen is in Houston. There's a company called Neuro. They've partnered with Houston Metro and a local grocery store to be able to deliver food to seniors. And this is particularly effective during the pandemic when there was a high interest in just contactless delivery. But this is something that we'll most likely see, and as we're thinking about the sidewalk and the bike lane, it might also be important to think about how do we integrate other types of automated vehicles into that planning process. And then there in the center, we also have drones. There are now, you can have fast food delivered by drones, but also the other use case that's of interest is, for example, like a CVS or a Walgreens. So those who are a little bit further out, they might be able to have their prescriptions or other Advil types of goods delivered in the air. So not only is transportation rapidly changing on the surface, but it's also having airspace management impacts. And then also of interest, I had prepared this presentation to take us all the way through driverless cars. And I believe just yesterday, Notre Dame had announced that Starship is now on campus. There's a partnership between the sidewalk delivery company as well as Grubhub. So students are going to be able to order food on campus and have these types of vehicles delivered to their dorm. And so they're already here in South Bend. They're on campus currently, but this is something that there might be a next iteration and future planning phase with them and others. Another major movement I wanted to talk about is what's happening in the connected vehicle space. So this idea that your car will someday be able to talk to other cars, it will be able to talk to the traffic lights, and it might even be able to talk to somebody who has a Fitbit and is about to walk across the street, and maybe their Fitbit sends out a signal to let you know that they're going to be crossing and that your vehicle needs to slow down. So these are important safety types of technologies that are coming. Some of the applications that are of interest are work zone warning, for example, where there might be a work zone that is either, maybe you don't know about it, maybe there's a lane closed, maybe there's a special event downtown, but that information can be broadcasted, and then it'll eventually be received in your vehicle, and you'll have that information and be able to make planning decisions. And even for the bus network, so the infrastructure will be able to talk with the buses, and when there are lane closures or crashes or other events, the bus system will be able to detect it and make route updates accordingly. And then another major wave that's coming is electrification. There's quite a bit of federal funding that's available. Indiana DOT published its National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan, and so there's going to be federal funding that's available for the state network. There's going to also be additional funding that's becoming available for the local network. And so something that the city can think about as this is occurring is just how to capitalize and be competitive for that federal funding, but also just what's happening on a local level. If you ask people why don't they drive an electric vehicle, a lot of people, it's that upfront cost. That's probably the number one thing that people talk about. And the number two is range anxiety. If I'm out driving and there's not, I can't fill up at the gas station, I don't know where that next charging station is going to be. So I'm nervous to be able to drive too much. And so those are two different barriers that the city can be thinking about as a way to help with the electrification rollout and thinking about how to support that system. And lastly, I wanted to talk about shared. We've already talked a lot about these different shared solutions, but there has been a shift. A lot of people in the younger generations, some of them don't have an interest in owning a car. Some of them don't have an interest in getting a driver's license. And so if that's the case, then what options are there going to be? And so how do we think about some of the different shared options that are available where they can access public transportation, the bike share, the scooters, or other ride-hailing services. And so these are kind of four major avenues. A fun acronym is ACEs. So if you're trying to think about kind of the four major trends in transportation, it's that automated, connected, electric, and shared. And as you can imagine, these things are heavily connected to one another. So a lot of the automated vehicles that I showed on the first slide are also going to be electric. And so how does that impact the charging and the infrastructure design needs that are going to be rolled out? A lot of other vehicles not only will be automated, but they're also going to be connected so that they'll have additional inputs from other vehicles or from the traffic lights, for example, that are becoming available. So think about these four major trends, and then think about what the city can do in order to incorporate them. Then I just wanted to close out with one final question and just see what types of innovations that you might want to see here in South Bend. Any cool tech that people have heard of that they would like to see here?
It's not really cool tech, but Holland, Michigan has heated sidewalks that that would be cool.
That would be nice. And then they're looking at inductive charging. So maybe you could have inductive charging. So maybe as you're driving over the road, it'll charge your vehicle, but also then maybe it heats it and then you won't have to plow the road as much.
permeable streets and permeable sidewalks.
Yeah, I think that's a great one, just in terms of as the environment becomes more built out, how do we think about all the sustainability and to be able to recapture some of the rainwater resources as well.
While this is not very, while this may not be very innovative, just having good infrastructure, I think, is important. And that's from basic infrastructure like curbs and sidewalks. But when you look at other infrastructure like traffic signals, we are so behind and in some of that technology that moving to, the smart signals is a huge leap. If we can just get some of that type of infrastructure to more of a, modern standards, I think that'll make a huge difference in how we commute, how we navigate the city. So just maybe both those things, basic infrastructure and then upgrading some of the other infrastructure we have.
Yeah, I think the traffic signals is a great place to start, and even just identifying key corridors where, especially if one of the big complaints that people always have is, I'm sitting at this intersection, nobody else is here, why don't I get a green light? And so trying to identify those places where you can upgrade the signals to be able to have automated detection, but then also it'll position the city for some of these connected vehicle applications that are on their way. And then I'll open up to just any types of questions. Go ahead.
I don't know how it is all over Michigan, but I've done some driving in Detroit, and particularly for large vehicles like semi-trucks. This is important, and that is the left, a very simple change. Having the left turn light at the end of the green cycle rather than at the beginning, because that way you don't have people rushing up there to try to get that green arrow.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have to stop anyway, but they know they're going to have a green arrow at the end.
Yep.
And so, there's, I think that in itself is a traffic calming kind of thing. And they also have, on many of the major thoroughfares, 2 lanes in each direction with ample room between them to do U-turns. And that way, let's say if you're going down this street, but you want to go down this street, rather than making a left turn across traffic, you do a safe U-turn and then a safe right turn.
Yeah, you brought up 2 different safety aspects, and particularly for trucking, I think it's important to look at all these different safety opportunities. Texas has something called the Texas Connected Freight Corridor Initiative. So it's looking at ways in which one of the applications is where the traffic lights can talk directly with the freight vehicles. And so they can provide things, they can extend the green time. So if you have a large number of trucks that are coming out all at the same time, like at a warehouse, for example, you can have dedicated green time to make sure that they get out safely, the other cars know that they're coming. And so that's another example of just how you can think about safety, particularly for the freight sector.
And then you have a left turn on, or a right turn on red after stop situation. I know of only one intersection in South Bend that is marked so that when cross traffic gets the left turn arrow, so you've got traffic turning this way, you've got traffic turning this way, but traffic over on the right here should be given the green arrow for the right turn at that point. Because they're not going to be crossing anybody's path. That way you can actually move 3 lanes of traffic instead of just 2 lanes of traffic.
And someday, the traffic signal will be able to pick up, and there'll be communications between however many vehicles are coming into the intersection. They'll go to the traffic signal and to the traffic management center, and then it'll be able to optimize the particular plan. So if you have a lot of cars that need to turn, well, maybe there'll be a longer green light. If you have a lot of cars that need to go straight, then it can optimize it that way. So a lot of what you're talking about, there are some early stage technologies now that are going to optimize not only the throughput, but it'll ultimately make a lot of these intersections safer.
Yeah, I figured that thing out a long time ago about turning right while the cross streets are turning right and turning left with their arrow. I figured that out a long time ago.
Yeah.
But there's only one intersection that I know of in South Bend that actually gives you that right turn arrow for that circumstance.
Nice. Any other questions? We covered quite a bit. We did housing and transportation, transit, as well as the technology side. Any closing thoughts or questions?
When we were talking about permeability and sustainability, like what have you seen that for like a long term for transportation that could have a positive environmental impact on like what methods?
I've seen it
practices?
either, particularly for sidewalks, and then any parking infrastructure that is required. I think because it takes up so much space, there are a lot of other things to do with parking infrastructure, but if it is required, to think about how to do it sustainably. And then I see that we're at time, so I just wanted to leave folks with a few closing thoughts. For each of the areas, I really just wanted to emphasize that first and foremost, housing and transportation are linked. There's a long history of where the planners were here, the transportation engineers were over here, there wasn't the communication, and it's been great to see just how much coordination is happening in South Bend, and I think there's a real opportunity with the neighborhood design to think about how the future of housing and transportation go together. The second piece around transit is that an effective public transit system for today, it really has the need for convenience and choice. We live in this on-demand economy where people want their deliveries now. They similarly want to be able to access their public transit system as readily as available and to be able to have a number of options so that I'm not just having to drive, but I can also take the bus, I can take a bike, I can walk places. And so thinking about how to pull all of these different things together and give people both choice and convenience. And then lastly, I just want to close on the technology side. There's lots of things to be excited about in the technology space, but it's ultimately important that it's going to be purpose-driven. So I just want to say thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm available to stay and answer any questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Trent. I think that was a really, really outstanding presentation and tailored specifically for South Bend. Thank you. Thank you very much.